So I'm Al Rizzo, the Chief Medical Officer for the American Lung Association. Really proud to be partnering with Prevent Cancer the last several years in this conference. As a practicing pulmonologist, I don't have a whole lot of expertise in the topic we're studying today, but certainly my panel does. I wanted to recap a little bit what we've been talking about since this morning. We know that improving the capabilities of the CT scanning really has transformed this annual lung cancer screen into a more general, personalized health interaction. More experience, we know now that the CT scan in eligible tobacco-exposed people can show us things besides lung cancer. We know now that emphysema can be seen, coronary calcification can be seen, and what we need to do now is develop these into the very important public health issues that they are, because these smoking-related diseases account for about 44% of the global premature deaths that we have. So emphysema, coronary disease are commonly diagnosed in the presence of symptoms. What we want to try to do now is move into an earlier space where we can maybe detect these diseases before the symptoms occur. And we've been discussing this at the QIW the last few years. LCAP has been talking about it. The Agile meetings that were held last year have brought this to the front as well. So what we're going to talk about today really is how do we improve what we're doing now, all the data that we have, and maybe get it into the hands of clinicians so that it becomes meaningful in the way they interact with their patients, and maybe improve their education about lifestyles, getting them off cigarettes, and importantly, when needed, putting them on the right interventions and therapeutics. So we're going to explore databases today, and as the title is saying, is there a right model? What are some of the strengths, challenges, and how do we build a database that can be used in order to promote research, therapies, increase the believability that we should use all this data to help patients. Like a lot of things in databases, there's layers of complexity, they often overlap. And what I'm going to do is introduce our three panelists and then talk about some questions I'm going to throw up in the next slide. But first we have Elizabeth Estes. She has an extensive 30+ year history in marketing and media. And quite honestly, her passion really is in healthcare marketing. And she is now the CEO and runs the Open Source Imaging Consortium, which is a global consortium focusing on bringing together academia, industry, and patient advocacy groups. The Lung Association has been along with her over the years to really make some radical progress in fighting interstitial lung disease at first. But we know that OSIC's goal is to use this AI information and machine learning to create digital biomarkers. This will help facilitate earlier diagnosis, response to therapy, and overall improve the prognosis in idiopathic IPF, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And now we also know that she's able to move on to other diseases like COPD. We also have Dr. Susan Wood. Dr. Wood received her PhD from Johns Hopkins. She was in the School of Hygiene and Public Health, and her PhD work was quantifying three-dimensional lung structure with changes in lung function using high-resolution CT imaging. She also holds a Master's of Science degree in Biomedical Engineering from Duke and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Maryland. Currently, she is the CEO for the for-profit company Vita Diagnostics, which has described itself as a precision lung health company accelerating therapies through AI-powered lung intelligence. And lastly, we have Dr. George Washko, who's a National Institute of Health funded investigator in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, specifically focusing his work in imaging and quantitative image analysis. He's a physician researcher at Brigham and Women's and an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and been involved with a number of databases currently, including COPD genes, spiromics, and the current lung health cohort study that was mentioned earlier, and we'll talk more about. So we have perspectives from a for-profit, a nonprofit, and an academic individual to give us perspectives on a few questions I've generated around databases. So if we could put up the next slide. And what I'm hoping is we're going to keep this up during the discussion. I'm going to ask each of them to kind of weigh in where they think they have their strengths and where they want to answer some of these questions, and certainly have the audience put in the chat questions they may have. But we'll start out with talking about what are their perspectives on what's data curation when we're putting databases together? And I'll open it up to the three of you to decide how to approach that.
I'll go. Hi, everyone. Nice to see some faces I haven't seen for a while. And certainly, Dr. Rizzo, thanks for the opportunity to be here. So as we talk about data curation, the panel, we've had a chance to kind of bounce this around a bit. You know, from just a very simplistic point of view, and I know it's not a simplistic topic, I would say that it's being able to leverage increasingly diverse data to organize it and use the data, search it, create it, understand it, and to find better information. Just some components of that. It's interesting that, you know, one of Ella's comments I wrote down here, you know, one of them is standardization. You know, what we had something in OSIC that Elizabeth might smile about, you know, different countries have different units for DLCO. So we had to, you know, kind of change what those units were. It looks like, to Ella's comment, you know, what is a risk factor for a lung nodule by size? You know, if you say the nodule's at high risk, that differs by, you know, department to department. If I got that right, I don't want to put words in your mouth. The components of the curation of the richness of the data, you know, how the data is labeled. You know, you can say it's a low dose screening exam of a patient, or you can say we've labeled the airways down to segmental +2 and have been able to evaluate the change over time. The quality of the label, Dr. Yankelevitz talked about, you know, using phantoms and acquiring good quality data. And I think that the important thing is that, you know, just mentioned Rick's grid here is the reusability. A lot of times you're acquiring data to ask question A, your algorithms get better, and that data has persistent value. So now you ask question B, C, and D, right? What's the you're finding a lung nodule? Okay, you go back into the database and you find you're asking a question about whether or not that patient has emphysema or coronary artery disease or interstitial lung disease. So you don't know often when you acquire the data what the next question is. You just have to make sure that you do acquire it knowing that it's going to expand, and it has imaging data in particular has very persistent value. So that's my 2 cents, 3 cents on data curation.
George, you want to go? Do you want me to go? Age before beauty, so I'll go first.
I went first.
I think Susan addressed part of it. So in our case, OSIC made a decision early on that looking for the ILD and fibrosing lung disease scans, we wanted real world data. And I know there's a lot of debate about that, but we wanted real world data so that the algorithms could be generalizable around the world for different machines, for different modalities, so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, we're starting to bring in photon counting CTs, and a lot of the algorithms are not backwards compatible. So that's an interesting little thing that we've learned. As we move forward in technology, the algorithms that have been built on the standard of care right now may or may not work or may not move forward. That's for another session, I think. But I think we made a decision to go for real world data and to reduce the bias, to have continuing learning, and then to have adaptation as different things came on. But because of that, we did have a lot of data that needed to be curated, and we call it normalized. So Susan mentioned one of it, right? DLCO measurements are different in different countries. Labels are different. Diagnoses are said differently and spoken differently. We had metrics, and then we had metric system and non-metric system. So in order to normalize the data, in order to make it robust enough and clean enough for our machine learners to take a look at it, it took a lot of data curation. I think that's obviously a big part of what's taken OSIC quite a long time to build, 9,000 ILD scans in our database. I will also say that, it reminds me, and one of the previous speakers talked about not even trusting AI for a recipe. It reminds me a bit of a recipe, and it's how do we back the train up And I get into arguments with people a lot from RSNA about, we have standards out there for ILD scans. We have them. Nobody's using them. Okay, that's part of the problem. How do we influence the first part of this, right? The first part of it, which is building standards. And when he mentioned the recipe, it's like, sometimes I feel like, we all want to bake a cake, but we have, instead of standard ingredients, we have like flour and sugar and eggs. We have stuff that's unfamiliar to us. We're using different sources and different measurements. And that's why it's so hard to try to normalize and curate this data. I think part of our job as people who want and need this from a clinical perspective to get to the patients, we got to back it up and start doing more influence campaigns to the RSNA to put out more standardization for these type of scans. It's systems theory. You want to change the output, you got to change the input. And I think we need to change that input and get more standards on the front end, especially for ILD scans. I can tell you we have some that have inspiration and expiration and some that don't, and they're all over the place. And I think our algorithms will continue to get better if we do a better job of trying to influence it on the front end. George, to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to say something maybe controversial here, that I'm not at all concerned about the standardization of imaging. We work with a lot of now clinical data, and if you think there's heterogeneity in imaging, wait till you actually use the EHR. Something as simple as tobacco smoke history. You audit that, and it varies from a lifelong never smoker to 100 pack years over the course of 3 months of documentation of the same person, right? It's things that are non-physiologic.
Yep.
We've pulled CT scans, we've pulled PFTs from people here at our institution. A not insignificant portion of people labeled as having COPD do not have expiratory airflow obstruction by spirometry. So I'm more concerned about what we're training against, right? I think the intra and even inter-image assessment is fine. Segmentation, if we're wholly dependent upon ground truth in the image, we can segment an airway, we can give label maps to different things. But the question is, what are we training against? What database are we doing? Data curation is about 98 to 99% of the elegance of any scientific investigation. Anyone can build a model of things after. And I'm not undercutting that, but the great work in watching people build these is the data curation, is building something and actually making sure we have outcomes of interest, right? And this has been the great challenge to working with clinical data. Aside from mortality, all of the things are almost impossible to audit.
Yeah, and I would say that. I also don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? Obviously, we're doing it, and we're having people who are using this data, all the clinical data. To your point, the clinical data is a hot mess.
Yeah.
And it's a hot mess all over the place. But trying to normalize that and curate it is what's taking so long. If we had some kind of standards that we could work to, it might make our jobs easier down the road.
Oh,
So
I agree. All I'm saying is the standards are not just the responsibility of RSNA. It's more broadly the clinical community, right? Because
That's
even
my point.
EHR, all the documentation is all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Okay, very good comments on that. How about when we had our little talk, we talked a lot about the meaning of the workflow, the clinical workflow, and how does the database seem to optimize that? How do we want to approach the workflow?
George?
Controversial. Why don't you go first? Okay.
Yeah, I'm edgy today. I'm edgy. Yeah, you can tell by.
Do
Yeah.
you have coffee? Do you have too much coffee today?
Not enough. It hasn't smoothed me out. So I think there's great promise in all the data analytics that we do, but if we take the example of the nodule discrimination, right? Predicting the etiology of a nodule as a benign or malignant is an academic exercise that is disconnected from the clinical workflow, right? As Ella had even put in the chat, that there is no room for feedback, there's no room for feed forward, there's no iteration. What you need is a broader systems management. How do you leverage data for clinical care, right? You need something that's integrated into the process, not a whiz-bang thing that can find and light up a little thingy on the image that is great, but never actually makes it to the hands of the bedside clinician. So I look, you have to start somewhere, so I agree these are more tractable solutions to do. But exactly, as someone said, we need to actually have an end-to-end system that can be used across imaging, but it's much more than imaging.
Okay, I agreed with that one. I want to, sorry, Elizabeth, me or you?
You go,
Flip for it.
you go.
The thing I was gonna add to that is that the workflow, what is incorporated in the workflow, what types of data beyond the imaging. And, you know, it's obviously that means a bigger burden on the first question, which is the curation, but understanding and standardizing that workflow is, and what you'd want to get out of it, I think would be essential to these clinical databases.
You know, and we're facing this a little bit because we're bringing, you know, we're starting now, we have these lung cancer screens in. And as you all know, the lung cancer screens we're looking at is to try to find the ILA or the ILD. And looking for the ILA to try to see if it'll turn into an ILD. But we're facing it a little bit because the clinical workflow is different from a lung cancer screen, obviously, than it is for an HRCT for a suspected UIP. So we're trying to normalize these together and figure out how those all go. So I agree with what both George and Susan said. It's vital that we figure out how we work it through the and into the data curation.
And orchestrate that workflow. I think that I think that AI can help. Like, I think it can help on the standardization. I was kind of surprised it wasn't in your matrix, the workflow automation component
Yeah.
of AI, Rick, in your I'll make a claim to that maybe afterwards, but you know, how we can automate the use AI to automate those workflows and standardize them.
Yeah, no, and I think there's even a broader opportunity for AI in the curation of data, right? I mean, there are, you can actually have models that are looking for hallucination. You could have techniques to minimize hallucination. You can look and screen for things that are biologically implausible or plausible, and consistencies across the data set. So my comment about about the pack your tobacco, right? That's an easy one. You don't need something whiz bang to do that. But there are broader things and phrases and diagnoses that may or may not even be compatible. And I think we're going to need to get into that, because ultimately we cannot curate the tens to hundreds of thousands of databases that we really need to make something as powerful as it can be, to leverage the computational capacity, right? We're the limiting factor with that. It's the ability to feed quality data in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's move to the next one now. You know that compliance of these databases can include things like protecting data, especially the personal data. Does encryption get used? What are the levels of security? All those considerations, firewall. Give me your views on what components of the database compliance are and how important they are, and what are some of the hurdles to accomplish this?
Elizabeth, you want to go?
No, you go. And then I have an opinion on it, but I'll let you go first this time.
I am shocked that you're going to have an opinion on this. Okay, so look, I think that building these databases and with compliance factors for security and privacy, you've got to build it into the onset. Data encryption, tokenization, being able to find your patient later in an anonymized system. Those components have to be part of the almost the table stakes of building these databases. Expandability to new biomarkers, I mentioned that before. New imaging indications, you want to be able to expand it into other imaging types, other types of non-imaging indications, to be able to incorporate those components into the database. I mean, this is all as we progress. The expandability, this is probably to George's first point, that, we have this really great structured data in imaging, and we kind of combine it with all this unstructured data that's out there. We have to be able to find the ability to put that unstructured data in. I think that some of the large language models will certainly help that. Access controls, who gets what data and when, what information and when. I think that's That's also important to incorporate into the database. And then sometimes the audit trail, who accessed the data, what did they do with it? And to be able to identify and to be able to file that. There you
Yeah.
go.
To add on to that, we've been doing it 7 years. And when we started, the cloud was not even a twinkle in anybody's eye. And so I will tell you, we made a lot of mistakes in the beginning, but the first thing we did was go to a GDPR law firm in Germany to try to have them help us figure out how we do this in compliance, right? A lot of people asked us from the beginning, Elizabeth, how'd you get around GDPR? I'm like, we didn't. We figured out how to work with it. So because our database was at the time only retrospective and now it's obviously longitudinal, we had to anonymize everyone's data. So it was anonymized before it leaves the institution. It comes into OSIC. It goes through an entire QC process that Vita helps us with. We have a white list of 400 things to make sure that even in the DICOM headers, there's nothing that's in there. We worked really hard to make sure that the database is compliant with GDPR. And if you can marry with GDPR, then HIP is easy, right? The one to the other. As we add more longitudinal pieces, I think Susan's right. It gets really important that we're able to tokenize and be able to find those as an institution who works with us adds another scan. We don't want to be able to follow that, but do that in a way that still is a compliant way. The security and safety, I mean, we work with Vita, they test it all the time. So we have a very strict and robust way of managing all the compliance through the database. And it was, probably the first year was nothing but trying to figure that out. And as we've gone on and changed it, just so you guys know, what we did just to make it compliant was we took everybody's birthday and back to January 1st, 1900. And we moved everything forward in weeks. And that's how we were able to live within the GDPR rules and got a blessing from them on how we did it. So that's how we did it. And then everything is normalized and moved forward. And now as the new ones come in, the longitudinal come in, they're tokenized and connected. We don't know, once you get in and work with the OSIC data, you don't know where they came from. We know regions, but that's about it. Interestingly, we battle these compliance issues, Al, and this is a big stumbling issue we're trying to deal with. And I don't know if the FDA is still on, but the FDA says we have to say where the data comes from in order to have the algorithms approved, and GDPR says we can't say where the data comes from. So we've got different regulatory bodies fighting over these compliance issues too. And so we've gotten through a lot of workarounds, but it's taken us 7 years to get to this point.
Yeah. Maybe the one thing I would add to this, less about compliance, but more around the nature of a database. The databases are not infinitely elastic. And so this is a two-step process to centralize data, to curate it, to train. But ultimately, the solution is decentralization, right? We're not going to be centralizing hundreds of thousands of data points and scans and things like that. That is not feasible. The sheer energy to mobilize, to clean, to curate all of that, it's going to have to stay inside to at institutions. And so we're going to have to think about a decentralized, and there are decentralized approaches to this, but to build. And obviously that has its own compliance issues that Susan was talking about, access, data trail auditing, things like that.
Let's move on. Sometimes in the media and some of the bioethics literature, the issue comes up about patients and their health data, and do they own it? Some people see their health data as being a product of their bodies and actions, and there's broad agreement that it's an individual who should not only control their data, but also have the right to make decisions about access to their data. I want to quote Dr. Eric Topol, physician researcher, and currently he's an author, leading author, and part of the U.S. Precision Medicine Initiative, all of us at NIH. He's issued a data manifesto for patients claiming you need to own your data. It should be a civil right. Now, what are your views on ownership, and how, if at all, does the 21st Century Cures Act play a role in how data is owned or shared with patients?
Well, I think he's right. I love Eric Topol. I think he's right. I think patients should own their own data. I think the ecosystem is not set up to want that to happen based on, what Dr. Artit said earlier, which was, trying to get a piece of the pie for every kind of data that's out there and trying to sell it. But I think that's exactly what should happen. I also say, in some ways, and I don't mean to belittle this, because patient privacy is paramount, right? We get all that. But in some ways, especially when you're working with a rare or uncommon disease, patient privacy is for the well. They'll share that. So I do think patients should own it. I've often said, and this is goofy, but I've often said, and I've seen companies coming out now, that the greatest use for a non-fungible token is not a piece of art or a baseball card. It's for your own medical imaging and your own medical data, that you can share it and own it. And then you can be the recipient of every time it's used, or you can give your remuneration back to each patient group. I could give mine to the American Lung Association. I think it's not, we're not far away from people trying to figure out how to do that. They already are. There's some who are out ex-US that are a little further than others, but I believe that it is the patient's right to own their data.
Agreeable, but maybe slightly different perspective here is that I think that owning the patient, owning and having ownership of their data, it's not easy to get. It contributes to patient understanding, quote Eric Topol again, the patient will see you now, right? And health engagement, right? You're going to be more engaged the more you know. I also think that you should know how it's being used, but patient empowerment can lead to better understanding of your treatment options, better understanding of what clinical trials are out there and how you can participate. I've never been asked to participate in a clinical trial. I've got a mom and a sister that both have had breast cancer, right? I'm clearly at risk. I don't know what trials are going on. When I go in, they don't segue me to anything in particular. It's just that it's one of the things, if you know what's happening with your data, I sign something off to say it's going to go into some trial, but I don't know. So I think the more you know, the more you're engaged. Part of this question had to do with the 21st Century Cures Act. So Al, I'm going to just address that in some soft way here. It is built around accelerating clinical trials and clinical trial research. The more that we are collecting data, it is for data generalization. I agree with George. We can't all collect one database and everybody use it and go and tap into it. I think that I will say, because I'm in the for-profit organization here, it is impossible for companies to be funded to go do this on their own, for every different clinical indication out there. They're just, what has happened previously is they'll get a regulatory approval on a really narrow band of patients. And then when that algorithm is used in clinical practice, the performance drops off quite naturally, because it wasn't used in a generalizable enough way. So I don't think that the companies owning all the data is the solution. Newer AI algorithms require more data and more information. The 21st Century Cures Act is focused in and around more generalization and diversity of data. And so I would just make that point as well, that we're going to need to be able to collect more generalizable data from multiple different sources.
Yeah, no, and Susan, I was actually thinking the word empowerment too, and on an individual level, I think it's critically important. You show someone a CT scan, you show them other data in the clinic, and they have buy-in. They say, okay, I understand what's happening there. A little bit of what you're fixated on, what you're talking about. I also think, though, we live in a fairly altruistic community, and it's rare for people to not want to give their data to be part of something to push things forward, right? We've done surveys, and for example, Al, this in the lung health cohort, and even in the younger generations, some of the main motivation for signing up is to be part of something, to be contributing, to move the science forward. People, with, I think, rare exceptions, want society to benefit from their learnings, from their hardships even, right? And so I think this is less of, we have to think about how we operationalize it, but it's probably less of a sticking point for the individual.
It's warm donorship,
Yeah.
everybody gives their organs to research, but why not do it when you're still fogging the mirror? I think it's kind of, you can do that now.
Yeah, and I think, George, to add to that, in a lot of ways, I don't think people understand what happens with their data. I was as naive. I always tell people when we started OSIC, I was either naive or arrogant, but I thought it would be easy. 15,000 scans. I mean, how hard could that be? Oh my God, right? And I don't think when I first started out, I remember the first institution that I went to, and they're like, well, we can get you 300 scans, because it was 500 scans for $50 a piece. And I'm like, wait, I have to pay for this? Like, no clue, right? So I think most people don't understand that. To your point, if they're asked to do it, most people will do it. And I think that is, I think you're spot on right about that.
So let's move to this last question, and then we'll open up the discussion. But part of this has to do with currently some of the databases I know George has been working with a lot, COPD genes, spiromics, and then also our lung health cohort study, which I'd like you to tell people more about. But how do you feel these databases are either currently being used or going to be used in order to improve clinical use and transform the care based on the information we're getting from these databases and cohorts?
Yeah. Well, maybe starting with the cohort. So, part of the challenge to the chronic respiratory diseases we have is the chronicity of the disease that we're studying. Lung cancer is very dynamic, whereas COPD and ILD is relatively adynamic. And so trying to do studies and, watching the progression of emphysema is an incredibly tedious thing. And it takes a lot of data and a long time, right? So what we have been doing, and not we, meaning the collective we, the community, has been thinking about the true life course of disease and sampling elderly cohorts, COPD genes, spiromics, middle-aged cohorts, younger cohorts, and with that you can impute a trajectory across all of the data sets, right? And if you have some foresight and planning and you try to harmonize, getting back to curation, harmonization, the data across these data sets, they become directly interpretable. What happens to the lung density over time if you're using a somewhat similar or the same CT protocol? And so, because these conditions outlive any one of our careers, and so how can we make an impact and pass on learning through these even pseudo-longitudinal or short-range 5 to 10 year studies, but at different time points across the life course? Maybe I'll pause there. We can talk more about that, and then we can circle back to the transformation of care, because that is I think a separate conversation. Well, I don't know, Susan or Elizabeth.
Talk about OSIC, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think probably what we're the most proud of in this past year, and I think Chuck Hatt is on the call, but 4D Medical, they built an algorithm, was in bio, then became 4D Medical, that received breakthrough designation device from the FDA, and it went into the Leahy Clinic. And it looked at, I think, a couple thousand, he can probably correct me, but a couple thousand scans. Long story short, they identified 59 people with ILD, and it was an overread. It was roughly 40 more than the radiologist identified with their own eyes. So OSIC helped them validate that because our data was dirty. It helped them validate that on our data. And we have 2 other companies who have also are in final throes of FDA, and then one in EU that's already in clinical practice. So what OSIC was able to do was they were able to build their algorithms, use our data set either to train or to validate, and then actually put it into clinical practice. I've said all along, I don't care if we have 20,000. Oh, thanks, Chuck. He said, "Whew, good summary." I don't care if we hit 30,000 scans. If we can't get this into clinical practice, we failed. And our job is to put ourselves out of a job. Our job is to make sure that these tools, meaning OSICs, our job is to make sure that these tools get to these patients so that we can either make a fatal disease or chronic disease or even better. And so I'm really proud, Al, of what the companies who work with OSIC, what they've done and how they've done it. And we're seeing more and more progress on the algorithms, down to a granularity level that is incredible. So I think we're seeing it. It's just taken 7 years to get to this point. And I say this, and a lot of people have heard me say this, right? We get a lot of props for being able to build this database the way we did, but it isn't lost on us that 80% of the people who were alive when we started are not. So none of this has gone fast enough. None of it.
Interesting. George, to your comment, this morning I interviewed Visha Benjiha, for the Beacon study, which is a really interesting cohort on early COPD and how that, obviously the natural history, and if you could piece all those components together. So I think a database, somebody in the chat mentioned like a virtual control or the ability to simulate with, what the natural progression would be for a patient with disease COPD, for example. That's certainly, a way. I think OSIC is a great initiative. It's a great start. The fact that it can be scalable to other disease states, I think is also, one of the areas that these types of initiatives will have to replicate. But I don't think that it's, to George's point, it's not going to be one database. It's going to solve this problem. So
it isn't, Susan, but I want to jump on that really fast. I will tell you, the Sarcoidosis Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research has joined with us, and they're going to use the platform and do some different things.
No question, the technology is an enablement. Yeah,
but there are some who won't do it because there are some patient groups and organizations who want to build their own. And I'm going to put this out there to the universe. OSIC doesn't need our logo on it. We don't care. We just want to speed it up.
That's
there to be used.
That's
the frustrating
That's
part.
the nonprofit component of it. And so I'm just going to spin that in a slightly different way, and that having, I think Rick said this at the beginning, or that, there's been the FDA approvals in the AI space have been led by imaging. They started in imaging. Most of them are imaging. But certainly a lot of these early regulatory approvals, maybe even some of the later ones, have been challenged by restrictive data sets. And companies are not built to be able to do that without access to larger databases, and newer algorithms are hungry for not just data, but high quality data to make those algorithms work. So it has to be access to OSIC type databases so that these algorithms can go, and all boats rise this way. You're competing at a very different level. If you have access to data, you create algorithms, your company can compete at a higher level, compete at a different level. But the benefit is to the end game, which is, for us, is to make sure the patients get therapies faster and better.
Yeah, no, and maybe one thing in thinking about transformational, right? That's several different things and across several different timescales, and transformational for an institution may be actually having access to a robust algorithm that supplants the need for multidisciplinary ILD conference, right? Because a lot of places don't have access to that. If you can have an adjudicated, meaning an automatically adjudicated CT scan, and provide a direction, that's a big deal for underserved areas. So that is transformational for that clinic that didn't have that, right? So meaning you're giving them a medication that a lot of other sites have access to. You're leveling the field, right? Another form of transformation is earlier detection. And so, for example, if you go back and look at the lung cancer screening CTs at Leahy, you're not just interested in ILD, but you're in the earliest fibrotic changes of people who may develop it, right? And if you can identify these people, you can we're now in the phase of starting to do clinical trials in ILA and not ILD.
Exactly.
And if you can catch people when they're relatively asymptomatic, that's a big deal. Because you can, instead of talking about adding weeks to months or a modest number of years, can you add a decade? Can you add 2 decades to a lifespan where they're not looking at transplant, but basically being more worried than about arthritis and other issues that come up over the course of a lifespan, right?
Yeah, and one other transformational thing, and I think Rick mentioned it, and or David mentioned it. The other thing that we're looking at and that we have a subset of the database. We have mostly CTs, right? HRCTs, and now some photon counting coming in. We have lung cancer screens looking for what George just mentioned. Can we see and these are actually interesting because they're lung cancer screens that have a confirmed ILD. And then, so we have pre and post, but we also have a subset of the database that are x-rays. And people, I remember our lead radiologist at the time, Simon Walsh, and some of you have heard me say this, he said to me, Elizabeth, why do you have x-rays? We can't see anything in an x-ray. And I said, well, you can't, but we don't know what the machine may or may not see. So
We
our
introduced
subset of,
David Yankelevitz evidently, so.
yeah. So what we have, David, is, I think we've talked about this in Croatia, but we have pre-x-rays, HRCT diagnosed by a CT, and then post x-rays. And from a machine learner, those are pretty powerful because now they're saying, hey, is there something in that x-ray? Maybe. And I even tell people, I don't care if there isn't, then at least we know that there isn't, but at least we're going to try. And the cool part about OSIC is because we're a not-for-profit, we can go out there and ask our partners, hey, can you grab us those x-rays for those HRCT? And they do it. Everybody is like-minded and passionate about it. And we've been really blessed that way for our partners to be a part of it. But I think that could be transformational, George, because as a myopic American, I said to somebody once in a conference, we're going to level the playing field. And somebody said to me, Elizabeth, 2/3 of the world don't have HRCT machines.
Right.
So you're not going to level the playing field until you figure out how to get other modalities involved.
No,
That's-
it's,
That's why we brought them in.
I will say that, sorry, George, I might go for it.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, just as an earlier point here, one of the things that we have done at VITA in support of OSIC and is that we have optimized the workflows to put these repositories together. And I think that that's an important, so the technology is not only there. I mean, IT, it's an enablement. It's an enablement to collect these data, mine data, curate the data, and have those data available. And that is a rinse repeat type of application that we can incorporate other types of clinical data, other therapeutic areas that we can look into. And I think that those workflow automations and enablements, just making data collection easier and accessible is one of the key things that we have done. I hope we have done in partnership with OSIC.
Yeah, and one of the things in thinking about transformation, I think the future is the chest X-ray, in part because that is something that you don't need to deploy any high-end algorithm. It's non-volumetric data. Obviously, it's a three-dimensional thing projected on a two-dimension, but you take a picture of it with your phone and you can interpret it. And so you don't need to do anything with it. You don't need a whiz-bang computer. You don't need anything. You can be anywhere there's an X-ray. You could take a picture and have a diagnosis. Yes, the performance may not be the same, but
But you can.
But you're well, exactly. But
Put a
people have-
radiologist in a small country hospital where I grew up in the middle of Illinois. They can't.
No, but everyone has a smartphone now, right?
Right.
You live, and everyone has a smartphone, and so everyone has access to that technology. That's a level playing field, right? So you can actually then identify people at risk. The quality of the diagnostics is not the same, right? You're not going to supplant a hardened chest radiologist who has read 100,000 films and anything like that, but it is a scalable technology.
Elizabeth, I have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned in the chat that if somebody supplies you with scans, they then have access to your database. Do you have a sense as to the number of researchers that are doing data hypothesis generating work or public?
A lot. We have 53 members involved, and you can imagine some of the bigger ones have 5-6 people working on them. So quite a few people. I don't know how many are working on it at a place like, 4D Medical, but quite a few. So each one. The thing that I think we're the most bummed about is the institutions that are giving us the data. So how it works is if you give us, it was 500, we really don't need a lot of ILD data. We've got so much committed, but if you give us 500 scans, you have access to the entire database. So that was the theory behind it. Just give us a few and then you can take it and use it. And so we have, different radiology AI and teams looking at it, but a lot of the institutions' own machine learning divisions aren't using it, and we want them to. We want more innovation on it. That's the whole point. And then as it relates to a business, if there's a business involved, then we just charge by their revenue, which is, as I put in the chat, is great for small businesses and horrible for us. But it's what we needed to do in order to bring real innovation in, right? I mean, there's a reason 4D Medical has gotten to where they are, in bio has gotten to where they've gotten to. They started out early with Caliper, moved it forward. And the companies that have come in to work with this, Vita and other ones that have come in to work with it, we need their brain power and we need their desire to do it quickly. So that's kind of how it works. It really is, give us a little and we'll give you a lot back, and we're matchmakers, right? I tell people, it's just like my mom used to say, I love all my children the same. I don't care which company gets there first. We just need somebody to get there, and we're an honest broker on it.
And what's the status of your COPD?
Well, we're bringing in, we don't have a lot of that, Al, to be truthful, because we moved to Alpha. So we have Alpha 1, we have sarcoid, quite a bit of sarcoid, which I don't think I realized till the other day when my right hand, Carmela Wedworth, showed it to me. And then we've got the lung cancer screenings. We've got bronchiectasis. So lots of different right now. Different ones in. We're trying not to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Everything we're doing, we're trying to do to augment what we have and stay focused. I know George asked me a long time ago, Elizabeth, why are you getting on lung cancer? Lung cancer, we don't know that space. That's not what we do. We care because of the ILAs and the ILDs. And we actually have we found a little interesting signal that we've shared. And so we're just bringing more in to try to prove the model.
And George, can I ask you to tell everybody briefly about the lung health cohort and what it's doing and what we envision it's going to do in the years ahead?
Sure. So this is, it's a partnership between the American Lung Association and the NHLBI. In fact, and it's being run through the ACRC, the Airways Clinical Research Network. This is a network of sites that have an expertise in clinical investigation that is funded and supported by the ALA. And it's really, without that ACRC and the partnership between the ALA and the NHLBI, we could never have gotten it done. And so, we say it every time, we can't say enough. The ALA has really sort of saved us and allowed us to move this forward. And the goal is ultimately, as I mentioned, to make this the Framingham lung study. So a life course, at least adult life course observational study. We're recruiting 4,025 to 35-year-olds from about 36 centers across the country. Standardized inspiratory, expiratory CT scan, the whole battery of questions, spirometry, oscillometry in a subset, DLCO in a subset. We're doing other sub-studies, xenon, MRI, a very broad biobanking. So we have a ton of biospecimens, always welcome collaboration, the ancillary study proposals, a quick plug for that. And we're about 2,200 people in right now. So a little over halfway, and we're doing quite well. Our major goal is to make it representative of us, of the broader population. So we want to look at sex, we want to look at ethnicity, we want to look at socioeconomic status. And so that's always turning knobs to make sure that we have the proper distribution as we're enrolling. As you can imagine, there's boluses of people, friends and family first, like all who we work with, and then other people that come in. And so, but we've done a nice job, I think, really broadening and diversifying the pool of people that we're working with. We ultimately, this initial funding was a cross-sectional study. So we are essentially the three pillars are radiologic, right? And that's how we're involved. There's spirometric and symptomatic. So how do we define ideal versus impaired lung health? Spirometry and symptoms. Symptoms are not normal. We've known that for a very long time. And they're highly prognostic for future outcomes, COPD, emphysema, these sorts of things. And we're also collecting the life course address history of these people. They're young. So we have satellite data for the US since they were born from the early 90s. And so everyone is geocoded. We have all the satellite data for the ozone, for the PM 2.5, all these other things. So we're focused on the broader exposome, acknowledging that it's not just tobacco smoke that leads to impaired respiratory health. And we're doing well right now. We're right about in the phase of, we're strategizing now with NHLBI about how do we continue to build and where, can we renew, how to renew, and we're anxiously waiting to see what happens in the budgetary planning for the NHLBI to see where our roadmap is forward. But I think we're in a pretty good place.
George, are you guys doing any home, I know that's they're, you know, all over the board, but are you doing any kind of home symptomatic or home spirometry, Bluetooth type devices for anybody and doing any proms? Was that in there as well?
So it's we have from the light touch, so we have the actigraph watch, right? So you give it to them, they take it, they send it back. But then we're also doing home spirometry, and that has been an amazing opportunity. And Boehringer Ingelheim partnered with us with the ALA on it. And so it's an amazing engagement, retention, and data collection strategy. So what we can do is people have a smart device. We interface with them, we make eye contact, we coach them through the spirometry, we then collect the data, and we look at reproducibility against the in-clinic spirometry, and then we can collect it. We started monthly, then quarterly, then annually, and we keep spacing it out. So we actually can get longitudinal data even in a cross-sectional study. And this phase, the 25 to 35-year-old is peak plateau and then the beginning of the sort of the cresting of that hill. So we can start to make inferences of how broad is that peak? How quickly do people start cresting and going down the hill? And can we start to collect that tail as people decline with age? So it's been an amazing opportunity. We've done it on over 2,000 people or so. And it's probably one of the biggest home spirometry databases around. And we're actually going to be presenting more of those data at the next American Thoracic Society meeting.
Well, we want to thank the ALA because they sponsored ours as well. So we have one starting recruitment. Dr. Kevin Brown wrote the protocol, but starting recruitment in the first of the year called Project Opus. The ALA helped us and supported us on this, and we're doing the same thing. So we're happy to share that data with you, where we actually have people who are identified as having pulmonary fibrosis, and then they will get a home spirometry. And to your point, what we find interesting about it is, the weather data and the air quality data around them. Is that causing some of those? So we're happy to share those results with you, and the proms. I know it's a little different, but maybe something to compare and contrast. We're taking our cue from the brilliant Dr. Marlies Weizenbeek in Rotterdam, who did this with 700 patients. And so it'll be interesting to see what we get in these patients who have been identified with an ILD. So thanks to the ALA, and the ALA has been a part of OSIC from the beginning. So Al, to your colleagues and you guys, we're grateful.
I did not pay you guys to say all this, but thank you for the ALA. Now I want to thank you for an engaging discussion. I don't see any more questions in the chat unless people in the room have anything. And we have a few minutes left. And I know Dr. Molshine wants to add a comment.
This has been a spectacular session, and I congratulate you on the progress that you've made. But the sobering thing that unfortunately also occurs to me is that in the course of the 21 years of this workshop, our biggest priority, consistent through that period of time, is building databases, imaging databases, to validate tools. And unfortunately, I don't think we're in a different place today than they were 21 years ago. If we wanted to talk about, and I'm focusing on lung cancer screening. And if we want to say to some person with an incredibly interesting idea, oh, go here and you can test your idea and refine it and this, that, and the other thing, I don't know where we point them. I would love it to be different. And so I think we've got to rethink our fundamental ideas about this, because if we're talking about this being a transformational thing in premature disease detection and stuff like that, this is a public health resource. And for a public health resource, you don't make a piece here and a piece there. You make a comprehensive something that allows you to systematically go through and check your efficiency and your performance and grow. And we reflect this in the fact that with our health systems now, we have HIPAA data and it's got all kinds of restrictions about it, but they exclude things that have public health importance that the institutions have to look at in terms of the quality of their own internal performances that we allow them to have free access to without the constraints that are imposed in these other settings, which are very appropriate. We should start thinking about advocating as a community for this kind of screening as a public health resource for the United States and for the rest of the world that should systematically acquire stuff that is done in real world at a certain fraction, 10%, let's say, of the new scans for lung cancer screening through some kind of federally supported agency were acquired, curated, evaluated for quality and safety measures, you know, in alignment with what we currently do for institutions doing quality control on their public health, you know, problems that we generally recognize. And we have a different situation that we have to adapt to. I completely agree that a patient owns their data, but we're not going to take their data. We're going to use their data with, you know, with the societal permission for certain types of things in de-identified public health types of way to accelerate for these tools. David Ian Calvert's sitting across from me, says, we're going to use AI tools for everything. We've got to have resources to allow these tools to be developed for everything in responsible, public health responsive kind of way with kind of cost margins that allow everybody to get access to these things. So I think we've got to rethink this thing and do something that's appropriate to the level of public health opportunity that we're really confronted with.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you're speaking to the proverbial choir here, because I came from the outside and I got in here and could not believe the fragmentation, could not believe how everything is split and why it's split. And it's an ecosystem that doesn't really encourage that, right? Dr. Molstein, I mean, it doesn't in a lot of ways. When I went to Europe, and Claudia and David did so much work in Croatia, their system is amazing. And what they helped them do there is amazing. And it's a country where it's small, but they're all coming into one place. So I go over there to meet with solace, thinking all of the European countries are going to work together on it. And David, correct me if I'm wrong, they've still all got their own little silos. And it's amazing. And you sit there and go, the technology's there. We can do this. We can do this together. It's just the ecosystem works against us. So, I mean, I'm happy to share O6 database with anybody that wants to use it. Again, it's not, we don't need a logo. We don't need anything. Let's just figure out a way to knock the silos down and figure out how we get all these together, that everybody can work on it in one spot. That would be my dream. And, you know, to make progress in that way. What you said was, I wish I would have been recording it, because it's exactly, you are exactly right. And it's so frustrating on this end of it. Sorry, George and Susan.
What?